Impulse responses. Anybody who follows my channel knows that for the most part, I like to just use the built-in stock cabs that we have in the Line 6 Helix, which are essentially going to be impulse responses with a few more bells and whistles to them. But we also have this amazing ability to add third-party impulse responses, and it's not really a topic I've discussed in depth in the past, but I want to do that because I receive a ton of questions about impulse responses. How do we load them? How do we use them? And a few other questions about which kind of impulse response block do I use? Do I use the 1024, the 2048? So today I'm going to take you through very simple in the beginning and how to get them into our Helix and how to use them. I know a lot of folks, most folks probably already know this, but just for those newcomers to the Helix, I want to cover that. It's going to be a very quick little demonstration on how we can use them and a couple things maybe that some folks weren't aware of. But we're also later in the video going to do a very interesting audio comparison that I think is going to be of interest to a lot of folks. So without further ado, let's dive over to Helix Native. I'm going to be doing this within Cubase using Helix Native, but it's all still going to apply to the Helix and even the HX Stomp for most of this. So here we are over in Cubase, and I have a little project here. You'll notice I have a couple instances of Helix Native open. I've also got an Ozone Match EQ up here that I'm going to use later for an audio example. We can turn that off for now, but let me just give you a rundown of what I have here. I have a little direct recorded sound that I played on my Vigier Expert Strat. It sounds like this with no processing. Okay, we're going to use that as an example later with Helix Native to kind of just illustrate some sound examples of the IRs that I've chosen for today. I've duplicated that track, and you'll notice one is called IR 2048 and one's called IR 1024. We'll talk about that also later on. But for now, we just need an instance of Helix Native open, which we are going to do right here. Now, first things first, we want to talk a little bit about how we can get our impulse responses into Helix or Helix Native. You'll notice there's a tab up here in the top left corner that's called IRs, and we have a whole bunch of empty blocks up here, 128 to be exact. So it's right up here beside where we normally see our presets. So we just select IRs. So one thing we can do to get IRs into our Helix or Helix Native is we could click an empty slot and hit the import button. And then that's going to allow us to choose a place on our computer that our IRs are located, maybe in a downloads folder if we've just downloaded some third-party IRs. And if I click one of these and import them, here it is, and it shows up in our list. Now I don't want that one in there. Now, another way we can do this is by simply dragging and dropping IRs right in to either one slot or multiple slots at the same time. So I have right here a little folder open with my IRs that I've created using my studio, and these are available on the Line 6 Marketplace. This is the RAV 212 Impulse Response Bundle, and these are IRs I've made using some really top-end studio equipment with my personal Rev 212 cabinet with vintage 30 speakers. I really love the sound of these IRs. I'm very happy with the way they turned out. So I'm going to be using these to demo what we're doing today as far as impulse responses go. So I'm going to pull this off screen because it's the only way I can drag them in, but I'm just going to take these. You'll notice I've highlighted all of them. Just drag this over here. I'll get Helix Native open again here. When I click off screen, you'll notice Helix Native disappears, but as I drag back in, you'll notice I'm carrying those 8 impulse response files here with me. Come over here and I can just select, you'll notice I can choose to put them in any 8 blocks that follow one another. I'm just going to go up to number 1 through 8. I release and I have these 8 different IRs up here. Now you say, okay, that's fine. They're in there, but how do I get those now to work within my preset? Well, over here, you'll notice if I even just close this block down here, I have an amp model, which is the Matchstick Channel 2, just with some stock settings that pop up. This is going to sound terrible if I go play this simply because there's no cab block on it, as you can hear. So let's pull this up again, Helix Native, and we're going to come over to another block, and we are going to come down to where it says impulse response in our blocks list of amps and cabs and effects that we have. So we'll choose that. And for this one, I'm going to choose a mono IR 2048 block. And you'll notice when I do that, Up here, I have a bunch of options. I have a low cut and a high cut, so I could put low cut just like I can on a stock cab block, or I could use a high cut. I could mix the direct signal with the IR signal. That's probably not going to sound great in most cases, simply because we're going to get some of that really grungy, abrasive direct tone. So most of the time that's going to be on 100%. And I've also got an output level where if we need more output coming out of the IR, we can boost it there. Now, the IR select is going to be the most important. Now, I could come over here and click it, and I get a pull-down menu. And it's basically just mirroring what we have over here. If you notice, I have all my IRs here. If I click this, I have these same IRs shown as over here. Or I could just even take my slider and slide through to select, or my roller on my mouse and roll through them. Or we can do it with the drop-down menu, whatever you're comfortable with. So now we've actually put this IR onto this path, and it's going to now process the matchstick amp model that I have here. So let's hear what this sounds like now. Now, as that audio is playing and looping, I could just kind of scroll through and select different IRs and audition them to hear which one I like the most. Let's try that out. Okay, so let's say I settle here on the JS RAV212 SM7B, which was actually shot using the mic I'm talking into right now as a little side point. So interesting stuff, works great, sounds great in my opinion. So I'm really enjoying that. I'm happy with what I have. Now, here's the problem. Some folks worry that what if I kind of reorganize my IR list here? And you say, well, what happens if this particular slot 6 IR gets moved? Well, let's take this slot 6 here, and I'm going to just copy it, and I'm going to paste it down here in slot 20. All right, so now, if I save this preset to my library, and I'm going to do that right now, let's say that my slot 6 gets deleted, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to clear that slot so it no longer exists, and you see that this says 6 is empty. Now, if I switch to another preset, such as this one right here, and switch back, you'll notice now that this preset is pointing to IR slot 20. It doesn't save the slot number that it's in, rather it saves by the name of the IR. So this IR, it knows it's looking for this IR, it went and found it, and it points this preset to that. So when I come back, even though slot 6 got deleted, I can still come over here and have the proper IR inserted, and Helix does that on its own. And we're back to our sound that we were expecting to hear. Now, just for housekeeping purposes, let's paste this back up here, and we will clear it out here again. Now you notice it says empty there as well, but if I switch to a different preset yet again and back, you'll notice now it points back to number 6. So I have two different presets here, and you'll notice if I go to this one here, I have the mono IR 2048 block pointing to this 6th IR. No low cut or high cut, mixes at 100%, levels at -18. If I switch to this preset, you'll notice that it's also an IR 2040, but we want to switch this one to IR 1024 and save this to our library. And we're also going to have this point to the same slot number 6. And actually, I should have waited to save it, but here we go. So now you'll notice with these two presets, I have one preset here that is using the 2048 block and one preset here that's using the 1024 block. So we're going to leave this one on the 2048 block on that 6th slot. And you'll notice this is on the track that's labeled IR 2048. And if we go over to this one here, which is labeled IR 1024, I'm going to have the same settings. We'll go to that 6th block, but this is on the IR 1024, and we will save that so that we have basically the identical preset. The only difference is that one is using the 2048 block, one is using the 1024 block. So this here is the IR 1024. You'll see again, it's set at IR 1024. When I go over to the IR 2048, you'll see that it's on the IR 2048 block with that same exact IR on both. That number 6 slot, the SM7B that we were just discussing and looking at. So these are identical presets except for using the 1024 block and the 2048 block, because that is one question I get from so many folks is which one of those blocks should you use? Now, a little word about what IRs we should use and what IRs can be accepted into the Helix. Now, Helix is very good at converting any IR that's in a WAV file format. So it actually works on WAV files that are mono, 48 kilohertz sample rate, 32-bit, and actually it's going to shorten whatever IR we have to the 2048 sample length, basically, for it to be recognized by the Helix and work properly. But the Helix will do that heavy lifting for you. So if you have an IR that is a different sample rate and a different length, it will convert it for you, but it's probably best practice to try to find the version that's the closest to that. So if you have something that's, say, 48 kilohertz and 200 milliseconds long, that would probably be the one you'd want to choose. Helix is going to shorten it, but it's not going to have to change the sample rate. But it will do it if necessary. The other thing to keep in mind is, you'll notice here that when I have a 1024 IR, I can come to another block here and add another 1024. I can't add a 2048. So we can have two IR 1024 blocks on a path, but we can only have one IR 2048 block on a path. We could put a second 2048 on path B if we so desired. Now, being able to add two blocks like this, we could add an IR 1024 block and drag it down so that we have parallel cabs if we so desired. But for this example, we're only dealing with the single block. So you'll notice if I go to my 2048 version, right away that I have a 2048. If I go to another block, my impulse response is grayed out. I can't load anymore. Now, some folks will ask, well, what is the difference? What are they talking about with this 2048 and 1024? That is actually representing the length of the impulse response in samples at 48 kilohertz. Now, you might say, well, that's a strange way to talk about it. Can't we talk in terms of time? Well, yes, we can, but you're going to see that these are actually very short files. So if we come over to our Cubase timeline here, and if I set this to samples on my ruler up here, and I come way over here and zoom right in, you'll see how close I have to zoom in. Now here we are at 2000 samples. Now if I keep zooming in, we're looking for 2048. So there's 2040, there's 2045, 46, 47, 48. Now if I put my cursor here and switch this back to seconds, you'll notice that it's about 0.042 seconds, or slightly longer than 42 milliseconds and slightly shorter than 43 milliseconds. So it's 42 point some milliseconds. Now if we were to switch this back to samples and go all the way back to our 1024 setting here, there's 1020 and there would be 1024. If we change it to the time, it would be exactly half of what we had for the 2048, which is about 21 milliseconds and change. So you can see here it's between 21 and 22 milliseconds. So it just shows you how short these files are. Now, the big question is which of these blocks do we choose? Which one is better? Do we choose the 1024 or do we choose the 2048? So 1024 or 2048? Well, one difference between the two is that the 2048 is going to use up more processing power. So if we're really cramped for processing power, we would probably want to choose the 1024. But then the question is, people say, well, do they sound different? I guess technically they should, and technically the 2048 should be kind of what people refer to as higher resolution. I think it's even referred to that in the Helix manual as being higher resolution. But in the real world, is this true? Well, this is the example I want to do today, and I want to do a couple cool things to really kind of showcase if there's a noticeable sound difference or any sound difference at all. So if we refer to Ben Vesco's amazing Helix DSP allocation chart, it would seem to me that when we come down to IR 1024 2048, that the readings are 9.33 for the 1024 block and 17.33 for the 2048 block, if I'm reading this correctly and how it is written out, because normally this refers to the mono versus stereo version. But I think what Ben did is just do the 1024 versus 2048. So we are saving some CPU power by using the 1024. But the big question is how do they sound? Well, let's take a listen to that. And again, just to show everybody that, I'm not up to no good here. I have two paths here. Right now, the 2048 block that you see down here is active. It's unmuted. But when I solo this 1024 block, you'll be able to hear these side by side. I'm just going to switch this back to bars and beats. So you'll see here on the 2048 block, we have the exact same preset setup with a 2048 block. None of these other settings changed on slot 6, which is the SM7B. And we just want to make sure that everything is set the same on this other block here. And it's the same thing, except it's the 1024 block, all the same settings between the two. I'm even just going to take my little match EQ and move it out of the way so nothing is on that path. So we have basically the exact same preset, except for the fact that in one I'm using the 2048 IR block and one I'm using the 1024 IR block. Let's listen. I'm going to flip back and forth. Like I said, when this is just playing as normal, you will hear the 2048 block. When I switch to the 1024 block, you will hear that. I'll go back and forth a couple times for you, and you can tell me what you think of the difference. What did you think? Now, I know that's a bit of a long sound sample to really be able to tell a difference. Let's shorten that up and go back and forth. We'll move this over to another segment. And we'll try yet another short segment. So I think we can see that if there is a difference, it's extremely tiny. Would it be more apparent with a different IR or a different type of tone or a different guitar? I guess it quite possibly could. So if we were to maybe take this a step further and maybe try to capture this in a more visual way instead of just relying on our ears. So this is where this tone match EQ comes in. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we could get the tone match EQ involved and have it capture the 2048 IR, get it to capture the frequency response of that, and then capture the frequency response of the 1024 and see how they differ. Not so much to match them, but just to see visually if there's any difference between them. So we're going to do that right now. So what you'll notice here is that I have the ozone match EQ on the 2048 version of the IR. And I am going to loop a little section. I'm going to let this play maybe 3 times through, and we will try and capture it within our ozone match, and then we'll switch the ozone match over to the 1024 track, and we'll see if we can see any visual difference and if that correlates to what some folks are hearing with their ears or maybe think they're hearing with their ears. So let's try that out. So I'm going to hit the capture button. I'm going to let this pass through maybe 3 times. I don't know if that really gives us a more accurate capture, but it's not going to do any harm. So one thing I want to do here to kind of get a baseline is I want to actually capture this again, the exact same thing, something we know that is identical, to see if there's any variance in what Tone Match is seeing on an identical track, so that we have kind of a baseline of how different it can be, because I don't know if it's going to capture it the same exact way. Let's try it out. I guess technically it should, but I want to make sure of this first and see what variables we're possibly dealing with. So let's do that same thing. We'll do 3 passes through here and we'll capture the exact same track first. Okay, you'll see I tried my best to stop that at the exact same spot. Now, if I take the amount of fine tuning and to 100% and smoothing down to 0, here's the corrective EQ that it wants to actually apply. And you'll notice it's very, very subtle. So it still is noticing a difference. I guess it's probably just in its processing of the average of what it was hearing. But you notice here, it's not applying any more than maybe, oh goodness, maybe 1/10 of a dB. Here's the 1 dB, -1 and +1. It has some little wiggles to it here, but it's really, you know, what do we have here? Maybe 1/10 of a dB. So really it's showing that it's almost exactly the same. If we get rid of that, you'll notice that the blue line, which you can barely see, is representing the second pass through, and the orange line is representing the first pass through. So you can see there's almost no variance there. So what we can do is we can clear this second capture. We're going to move this over to the track now that's going to be the 1024 version. We're going to capture it again the same way. We'll do 3 passes through, and then I'll try to stop this at the exact time. And we'll see if the match EQ then tries to correct it more than we saw with that particular pass that we just did. And that'll give us an idea visually of what the difference is between the sound of 2048 and 1024 IR blocks. I don't know how scientific this is. It's just something that I thought would be fun to give folks a visual of how things might be different. So let's do this. Let's capture this again. Let's see if I have that set to loop. I do. We'll bring this down. Okay, so I'm gonna hit capture and go. Like I said, we'll do 3 passes and then I'll try to stop this again right on that last chord so we get as close to the same thing as we did the first time. All right, so you notice when I stopped it. Now this gets interesting. Okay, so if we come over here and do 100% on the fine tuning, you will notice that there's a lot more corrective EQ being applied now. Up here in the high end, it's very similar to what we saw with the 2 identical captures, where we have maybe a little spike here of what, 0.2, 0.3 dB. Probably not going to be too audible. You'll notice here, though, that we have maybe half a dB, almost down to -1 dB here, just above 1 kilohertz. It's trying to correct about -1 dB here around maybe 400 hertz, plus 0.3, 0.4 dB in the 300 and maybe 50 hertz area. I'm just kind of guessing here. And you'll notice the low end is where it really starts to roll off here. Now, if we get rid of that correction altogether, you'll notice the blue line is representing the 1024 capture, and you'll notice it does move away from the original capture in spots. The high end seems very close. Here we have a little difference. Lower end is where it starts to get a little different. And everything kind of below, like, let's say 75 hertz, you'll notice it doesn't roll off as much. The 2048 cab actually rolls off steeper below there. Not necessarily what I expected, but we do have this visual now where we can see that there is technically a sound difference. Is it audible? Well, that's going to be up to us. I know there's going to be folks that will swear it is audible 100%. There's going to be other folks who will say, any difference is negligible. I'm not here to try to tell anybody one way or the other which is which, but we can see that there is a difference. Now, it's going to be up to us to decide. Now, the problem is, a lot of times when we're doing these comparisons, There's confirmation bias involved. If we know what we're listening to, we will tend to favor maybe supports our existing beliefs. There is that. There's the other thing that maybe we listen to too long a sample and we're hearing variables in the way that, you know, the guitar was picked at one part, say the sample that I was playing, one is a chord strike, and then there's some more like kind of lead noodling. And if we compare the 2048 on the chord strike against the 1024 on the lead noodling, that's going to be a variable. So really difficult stuff to ever know for certain whether there's a huge difference. But I think we can see from this that there's not going to be a huge difference. This low end stuff below 75 hertz, probably not going to be as big a deal as a lot of folks think, simply because there's not a lot of sonic information for guitar kind of below that. So I figured one fun way to be able to see if we can tell which is now I'm going to play you some samples of the 2048 versus the 1024, but I'm just going to label them as tone A and tone B to get rid of the possibility of confirmation bias. We'll listen to those, and then I will come back and tell you which was which. And then hopefully that can help you to further decide whether there's a big enough difference here between 1024 and 2048 that it is worth giving up that little bit of extra CPU processing power that maybe we'll need or maybe not. This is just kind of a fun, interesting experiment. So let's give those a listen and see what your conclusions are. Okay, so here we are back from listening blindly to those samples. And what I will tell you is that tone A was the 2048 sample and tone B was the 1024 sample. I don't know. I'm not here to tell you whether you heard a difference or not. It was more just to put this out there so that folks could make up their own mind and decide. So basically, if you want to save a little bit of CPU power with maybe minimal change in sound quality, I'm thinking the 1024 block is perfectly acceptable. Whereas if you really feel you hear a difference and the 2048 block is something you need, then by all means, go ahead and use it. That's why it's there. Keep in mind, you will only be able to use the one IR per path. If you want to use two, you would have to split them into two different paths. So there's always going to be some give and take here. And I just wanted to put this out so that folks, number one, understand how to load the IRs in and all about using impulse responses with the Line 6 Helix. And number two, just to give a little bit of a more in-depth look at the actual difference of whether we should be using that 1024 block or the 2048 block, since that's a question I get so much. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you guys so much for sharing your time with me. Please like the video and share it with anybody who you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching it. And please subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.